If you want to know how to brighten any model railroader's day, become a mailman. This package is the first among a few more that will be coming as a product of Christmas money. This first one is an operating sawmill, an accessory I have always thought was charming, which will finally replace the sad little plastic bin that I had been dumping my logs into up until this point. After test fitting the placement of the sawmill with my log dump car, I finished adding the little details onto the accessory. And while I was searching for the wiring diagram, I found a nifty little warranty card. I better keep that in case I need to have this repaired anytime in this bright new year of 1980. Anyways, I got the included wiring set up for a quick test to make sure everything worked. And when I did, it didn't. Immediately the logs jammed and the little belt that pushes everything through was snagged. I knew this meant some fine-tuning was in store, but not today. And then it snowed. A lot. I mean, check out that accumulation on Mary's head. A lot of snow meant a snow day, so I did my work and practicing from home. Megan and Amelia also happened to be out of town visiting Megan's family, so I was left alone while the snow piled up. But then how? Oh, how else would I spend the rest of my time on this snowy day? What could possibly consume my time while I wait for Megan and Amelia to return and for this next remote workday to roll around? Fortunately, and quite honestly amazingly, the mailman offered me a solution. 2 solutions, in fact. The first solution was a set of trestles that would finally allow me to get started on the upper loop of track. The second box here is a little more fun. Let's see if you can take a guess. Earlier, I got an operating accessory for an operating car I already have, and this time, I got an operating car for an operating accessory I already have. And here's a hint. Yet another dump bin to add to my bin collection. If you guessed correctly, you would have guessed an operating barrel gondola. This is the yellow ATSF version, and it will go with the barrel loader on the far siding of the layout. But right now, the layout is a mess of boxes and packaging, and before I can test the barrel loader and gondola together, I need to get this cleaned up, otherwise I will lose my mind. And not just lose my mind, but maybe my fingers, because it's so freaking cold, so I gotta warm those up with my tiny space heater. Anyways, it was on to getting these barrel accessories together. First, I assembled the little worker onto the gondola and then tested the gondola itself, which was pretty successful. Fine-tuning necessary for sure for placement of the loader, but a much better start than the sawmill. Now it was time to set up again a crude wiring test for the loading function of the loader onto the gondola. First, I unloaded the barrels from the gondola, and then I moved the gondola down to the other end and loaded the barrels into the gondola. Once again, pretty good, but again, fine-tuning to come off camera. Now back to the sawmill. I saw on an OGR forum post that someone was also having jamming problems and found a solution in propping up the sawmill like a quarter inch or so. So I gave that a shot with the O-gauge ties right next to it, and sure enough, it made a difference, but I think I'm going to end up opting for trimming the length of the logs to better fit, so as to avoid the sawmill being too close to rolling stock. Now, at this point, I began assembling the trestles, mostly off camera because I just needed to focus. And probably because it wouldn't have been prudent to show the rage on camera of dealing with these tubular track trestles. On top of this, I was short some straight track and had to steal some from the sidings, and then after that, I ran out of trestles. I had also made the rookie error of picking up a box of O27 trestles in addition to my initial box of O-gauge trestles, meaning those only fit the O27 ties and have these little nibs on the end that latch onto those lower profile ties but don't fit O-gauge ties. But I was not ready to accept defeat and spend more money getting the right trestles, so instead I just took a pair of snippers to those nibs and got the O27 trestles to fit just fine and was able to slide the O-gauge ties right in. And now, the base structure for the upper loop is loosely assembled and ready to be secured to the table. Ignore that one. But before I could secure the trestles, I already had clearance problems. Fortunately, all the way back in episode 1, I had some spare short pieces of track I had trimmed down and was able to throw those in the bottom loop to make the clearance on this side. With those in place, it was time for a couple tests. The red caboose there ran around the upper loop just fine, but the lower loop still had clearance problems, this time going under the upper loop. So I opted to compromise and just make the upper loop fit within the lower loop like this, which also meant I could return those straight tracks to the sidings. And so here is what the 2 loops look like now. Was it worth this trouble? For some, yes. For some, no. For me, honest to goodness, I went through this trouble just because I wanted a bridge. And also this shot right here. It just looks so classic to me, and I love it. So after wrapping up this first phase of the upper loop, I thawed my frozen fingers again with my tiny space heater and called it a day for the layout. And then it got cold. Like, really cold. So cold that I decided to bring in a few of the trains, my 224E and Santa Fe FT, including this big old ZWL. We'll get to that shortly, why I have it. But the cold didn't stop me. If I couldn't run trains since they were inside, I had to take care of some odds and ends, like wiring. Maybe in another video I'll talk about my wiring choices in depth, but right here I'm just rigging up some feeder tracks to tie into some bus lines. Drilled some holes in the table and got those tracks in place ready to wire up. I also trimmed down those logs and rounded the ends with some sandpaper, and now the sawmill works much more consistently. Eventually, it warmed up enough to bring some of those train things back outside. I hauled my ZWL out to the garage, but as you can see, it's kind of an acrobatic act to get into the garage to begin with. So standing there and looking at this poorly used space, I made an impulse decision to reorganize the entire garage, but most importantly, moving the layout against the garage door. The whole space is much better now, and with the table against the door, I have easy access to the backside of the layout, and when the weather's nice, I can open it and have a nice natural backdrop for the layout. After moving everything into place, I brought out the remaining trains, and since the weather had improved so much by this point, I opened the garage door, just in time for a good friend of ours, Anne, to make a cameo appearance perfectly framed through the trestles. Anyways, after a good laugh about the perfect timing, I unboxed the ZWL. ZWL is definitely too much for what I have, but it came from my old big layout, and since I won't have a big one anytime soon, I figured I'd take advantage of this monster transformer and use it here. Plus, it at least looks like a classic ZW. I got both loops wired up for a test, which ended up turning into just a fun little evening running session. Honestly, seeing both loops in action convinced me of my decision to have an upper loop. Plus, the ZWL has actually been good for some of these accessories that draw a lot of amperage, like the milk car, and I can even see how much it draws to the meters, which allows me to fine-tune the voltage needed. And then finally, the last piece of the puzzle to finalizing wiring came in the mail: T-taps. This is my method for wiring feeder tracks into bus lines. I eagerly set out to finish this wiring project that otherwise felt like trying to get kids to eat vegetables. At first, it wasn't working, only for me to realize I had managed to plug the T-taps incorrectly into the bus lines. I eventually figured out my error and finished wiring up the other feeders. See now how this garage door comes in handy. And then powered up the track. To my amazement, nothing was shorting out, and best of all, the power drops I had been experiencing were entirely eliminated. This just left accessories to wire up and organizing the wiring mess under the table, which I'll probably just do between episodes. But with a proper power source, completed wiring, and 2 loops of track set in place, it's time to start thinking about my favorite part of building a layout: scenery. Thanks again for watching. More to come.